welcome to the final section of our Intro to Variables in Kotlin. The final topic is going to be on nullable variables. We'll take a look at what it means for a variable to take on a null value and how to set them up, and also how to safely check for null values without crashing your program. So let's head on back to main activity. Again, this is all the code that we wrote previously, and now we're just going to put this new stuff at the bottom. So we'll say nullables down here. So what is a null value? Well, when a variable takes on a null value, that essentially means it has no value associated with it, and trying to access that particular value can and will cause our app to crash. Now, this is a little different from having, say, an empty string or the value of 0, okay, because these still have values. Even an empty string is still a string. It's essentially just an empty array, and the value of 0 is still some kind of a value. However, if either of those took on the value of null, and we tried to, say, add that null value to something else, then we would get the app crashing. If we try to access the length of a null string, that's again going to cause our app to crash. So we have to be very careful with how we use them. Now, if they cause so many errors, why would we even have null values? Well, sometimes it's just appropriate to have a variable take on the value of null if it makes sense for it to not have a value. For example, let's say I'm entering someone's info, okay, and they only give me their first name but not their last name. Well, it wouldn't really make much sense for that last name to be an empty string. Perhaps the last name would be null if the user forgets to enter it, okay? So that's, again, a bit more appropriate, and there are ways in which we can check, see if values are null in a safe fashion. We'll explore those in a second. Let's just see how to set up a nullable variable. Well, nullable variables can take on any of the types. So these primitive types that we've seen, they can take on string types or custom object types. We just put a question mark after them, okay? And this declares them as nullable, which means they can take on the value of null. None of the variables we've seen so far could be null. So for example, I could not change my isDoorOpen or isDoorClose, okay, isDoorOpen equal to null. Okay, it's just not allowed because it's not a nullable variable. However, let's just say I have a variable that is going to be my last name, and this is going to be of type nullable string, and I'm just going to actually give it a value this time. Doesn't necessarily have to have a value. It could take on the value of null. Note if I do this, then it's going to cause me no errors, but I will give it a value this time. And let's say we want to perform some operations on it. By the way, we're not just restricted to strings. Again, any of these types could take on a nullable type instead of the non-nullable type. So let's say I want to get the length of this string. Usually I just call on my last name, dot, and then I get the count or the length. So length, okay? But in this case, this actually throws me an error. Okay, and the error is that I'm trying to get this and store it in a regular integer, but I don't know whether or not this is actually null. If I'm not 100% sure if this is null, I have to use this question mark. So what this does is it says if last name is null, we're not going to try to get its length, we're just going to return the value of null. Because if I didn't do this and I tried to access length, I'd get my app crashing. If I know for a fact that my last name is not null, I'm absolutely 100% sure, I can use this double exclamation mark, which says that last name is definitely not null, so we can definitely return its length. Okay. Now the difference between these two operators is that my length usually returns an integer. So in the string case, if I just took the length of a regular string, it would return me the integer value of that length. So for example, full name would just be my first name plus this, so it's just 6 plus 6, it would be the length of 12. However, this is the length of 6, but because I'm not 100% sure if it has a value, let's say val length is equal to this, then length doesn't have the type of int, okay, actually has the value of, or the type of nullable integer. Okay, so this can later cause issues down the road, and if I know that this for sure has a value, I'll want to force unwrap it using this double exclamation mark, at which point I can store this in a regular integer. Okay, so generally speaking, we like to use, I'm actually just going to copy this and paste it just so that we have the two examples, and I'm going to comment this guy out. So generally speaking, we like to use this form of things because it's a little safer. This way our app doesn't necessarily crash if we try to access a null value, whereas we use this, it's going to return us a nicer result, but at the risk of having the app crash if we don't know that this is null. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about as far as null variables go. We try not to use them where possible, but sometimes it's just appropriate to have a null or a nullable variable. and at least now you know how to use them safely. So again, as always, have a little fun with them, play around with nullable variables, maybe try some examples of different types such as booleans, characters, ints, etc. And once you're ready to move on, we can move on to our next major topic, which is going to be collections. Okay, so I'm going to move all of this stuff over to our variables texts, and so that way we can start from a clean slate.